So welcome and good afternoon. I'm Leo Villalon from the International Center. And on behalf of the International Center, we're very happy to co-sponsor this workshop put on primarily by Latin American Studies colleagues here, as you will see. I want to take a second to thank my colleagues in the International Center, Jessica Childers back there, Nikki Kernahan, Vanessa Feo, et cetera, for all the organization here today. So on December 17th last year, December 17th, 2014, I had a regularly scheduled meeting with the provost. I meet with him periodically. And I was about to literally leaving my office with the same folder in my hand, and I got his text from my son in New York saying, Obama's about to announce opening of relations with Cuba. And I came running back into my office and Googled for a second and said, oh my God, it's true. So I ran to my meeting with the provost and ran in and said, breaking news, Obama's about to announce an opening with Cuba. And he said, really? And I thought, wow. I'm good dean of International Center. I'm on top of it. Even though I, for one, did not know it was coming on that day. And I don't know how many people did. Probably some of you had some inkling. But I think it was a surprise for a lot of us that it was coming on that day, even if we saw that we were moving in that direction. The provost certainly didn't know, so that gave me a little kudos there. Immediately, we started talking about what the strategy should be, right? What does this mean for the University of Florida, this opening with Cuba? From the very beginning, of course, I said, well, Cuba's hugely important. We have a history already, but there's so much more we could be done and so many possible areas of collaboration and so many logical partnerships there, and we need to really move to strengthen that. As I think all of you know, it was right before Christmas, and then we had a brand new president of the University of Florida join us in January. President Fox came on board. And of course, Cuba is a politically sensitive topic in the state of Florida. We all live here and know that. And so there was a lot of sort of what do we do next? The provost asked me to prepare a short white paper on Cuba for the president, and thanks to Phil and actually most of the people on this table, and Carmen Diana Deer, who's not here today, and others, I picked everyone's brain and prepared a little report for him, basically saying, we have a long history of ties, we've been significantly hamstrung by the legal and political environment, but this is now a real opportunity, and we should seize it to move in terms of building these ties. And so, that was the point of that argument again, and it's continued. As I think you all know, Florida in particular was hampered by specific laws of the state of Florida, and specifically the provision that no money that came through the university in any way could be used to sponsor any travel to any country on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. And Cuba was one of 5 countries on that list. But again, as I'm sure many of you know, in May then, some 5 or 6 months later, Cuba was finally taken off on 29th of May, was finally taken off of that list of state sponsors of terrorism. And so I went running to the provost again and said, no, Phil and I were talking, now we move. But there were still some lingering concerns. There was actually an older state law in Florida that raised questions about what we could do with countries with which we did not have diplomatic relations that had not been previously enforced, but there were some concerns about it. And so we thought, okay, let's think carefully about how we proceed. But then, of course, in July and August of this year, embassies were opened by Cuba in Washington and by the United States in Havana, and that clearly signals diplomatic relations, and so all of the Florida legislation that made things difficult has been now moot and removed, and we're ready to go. And obviously, Cuba remains there an embargo. I heard this morning on the radio again, Obama apparently called, made some comments at the UN, I believe, yesterday about the embargo and trying to lift it. But we still have some restrictions, and yet, obviously, from the perspective of the university, we are keen to build this very natural set of partnerships in our closest neighbor in many ways, right? Certainly to the state of Florida. And so this workshop, I think, from the perspective of the International Center, when Phil approached me, I said, we'd love to co-sponsor it. The purpose of the International Center is to help make possible what everybody on this campus wants to do in terms of working globally and engaging internationally. And that includes, of course, bringing scholars, sending students, doing research, organizing study abroad programs, and for that matter, teaching and research promotion of various sorts. And so we're here to help, and I would please ask you to let us know how and if we can help. The substance of all that, of course, depends on the folks who really know what's happening on the ground. And I will now turn it over then to Phil Williams, my colleague, Director of Latin American Studies, who will tell us a bit more about the program and introduce our panelists. So thank you again very much for coming, and I look forward to this discussion.
Do I need to use it?
Yeah. Was it... were you able to hear me in the back?
Is my microphone projecting? No. Yes, it is. Okay. Well,
I won't repeat all that. I'll give you the Cliff Notes version later.
all right. I'll just turn it off
think I
and give
can
it
turn
to.
it
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Thanks, Leo, and thanks to everyone for coming. I want to welcome you on behalf of the Center for Latin American Studies and the UF Cuba program. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, the UF International Center, IFAS, and also the College of Business for providing us with this venue today. As Leo said, the purpose of this workshop is really to provide a resource for you drawing on the experience and learned lessons of faculty who have expertise in Cuba. For those of you who have an interest in academic engagement with Cuba. For those of you who are interested in debating U.S.-Cuba relations, this is not a forum for that purpose. I will let you know that in January with the Graham Center, the Center for Latin American Studies is actually organizing has invited a speaker, Ambassador John Caulfield, who was recently the head of the former U.S. interest sections in Cuba, and he will be speaking exactly about that topic, U.S.-Cuba relations. Before introducing the panelists, Leo mentioned the history between UF and Cuba, and I just wanted to go back a little bit. I think it's important to point this out. It actually dates back to as far as 1930. During the commencement ceremonies that year, President Tigert announced the establishment of the Institute of Inter-American Affairs, which was the forerunner to the Center for Latin American Studies. And to demonstrate the seriousness of that initiative, Tigert awarded an honorary degree for the first time to a Latin American citizen. The Cuban ambassador to the United States, also a law professor at the University of Havana, Dr. Orestes Ferrara. During Tigert's tenure, the Institute, despite a serious lack of resources, made available scholarship opportunities for the first time to Latin American students, including students from Cuba. And UF also, during Tigert's term, signed one of its first international cooperative agreements with the University of Havana. Prior to and after the Cuban Revolution, many Latin American studies faculty conducted research related to Cuba and maintained academic engagement and collaborative relationships with Cuban counterparts. Despite the difficulties for especially Florida-based universities to engage with Cuba during the 1990s, an important UF research program got underway here in IFAS on Cuban agriculture. It was funded by the MacArthur Foundation in 1994, and it opened up an ongoing research collaboration between ag economists here at UF and the University of Havana, and that continues to this day. In 2004, my predecessor, Carmen Diana Deere, established or convened the Cuba Working Group, which brought together over 40 faculty with expertise and interest in Cuba. Then in 2009, the center established the UF Cuba program. Despite the additional restrictions here in Florida that Leo alluded to in 2006, the Cuba program and affiliated faculty continued to maintain an active agenda of academic engagement with Cuba. This included, since 2009, the signing of several new cooperative agreements with Cuban institutions, the launch of a center-based research project on Cuban agriculture, 2 study abroad programs that we're going to hear about. In 2011, we hosted a visit by the Vice Rector of Research from the University of Havana. That was followed up a year later by a visit of 11 faculty members from IFAS and the Center to the University of Havana. And then the hiring of Professor Lillian Guerra in 2010 opened up a renewed focus, particularly on Caribbean and Cuban history, as well as new collaborations between our libraries and Cuban institutions for the preservation of research materials. Leo alluded to the announcement by Obama in 2014, and this really, in December 2014, created this historic opportunity for UF to become a leader, a national leader in academic engagement with Cuba, especially given the history of engagement we've already had. And I think I can speak for the UF leadership, and certainly on the part of the Center and the UF Cuba program, that we're very much committed to moving this academic engagement forward in an important way going forward. A good example, just this fall, there have been a number of activities that have been happening here on campus. Just last week, the College of Law hosted 2 law professors from the University of Havana for a week. We have faculty going from IFAS next month for a couple of different conferences to participate. We have a professor of architecture, Alfonso Perez Mendez, is taking a group of students on a study tour in November. The Law School and the Center for Latin American Studies are organizing a visit of law faculty and administrators from UF to visit counterparts at the University of Havana. There's 5 scientists from the Institute for Plant Protection who were supposed to arrive on Saturday, but because of visa issues are rescheduling their visit. I've also heard that the Florida Museum of Natural History, Doug Jones and a group is going to be heading down, is it next month or the following month? So you get an idea of all the activities. And finally, I should also mention that we've invited the Director of International Relations from the University of Havana to visit the week of November 16th. And if you're interested in meeting with her, she'll be here the whole week. Please get in touch with me so we can set up meetings. In his announcement about the normalization of new relations, Obama also used the very common refrain, no es fácil, to speak about the difficulties that may lay ahead for normalization. It's also a very common refrain in Cuba about the difficulties of everyday life, I think. And if there's one message we want to convey today, despite the great opportunities for academic engagement, no es fácil. And we're going to hear about some of those difficulties. We're fortunate to have 4 faculty members who've played a leadership role in advancing new collaborative research and academic engagement with Cuba. To my immediate left is Dr. Lillian Guerra, who's the Waldo Nykirk Professor of Cuban and Caribbean History, Dr. Tom Fraser, who's Director of the UF School of Natural Resources and the Environment, Bill Messina, who's an agricultural economist for the Department of Food and Resource Economics, and Dr. Fred Royce, who serves as the academic manager for the UF University of Havana Cooperative Agreement. So we're going to have the presentations in that order. I've asked our speakers to limit themselves to 15 minutes so that we'll have plenty of time for question and answer afterwards. So first of all, Professor Guerra. Let me pull up here.
Oh, goody, you're going to do that part?
Yeah, I'm going to do that. Well, you're going to move the slides. But
So how do I move the slides? This,
you just use this.
this guy?
You can use that one.
Buenas tardes. It's wonderful to be here. I only have my phone because I want to make sure that I'm on time and I need as many clocks as possible. First, I want to say that I have been leading trips of students to Cuba since 2001 at 3 different institutions when it was much more difficult than now and when we certainly didn't have diplomatic relations. And I'm going to speak mostly about what we've been able to do here and show you some of the content of the experience. But you should know that, in fact, I have never worked with the University of Havana. I had always worked with organizations that were either directly related to the Council of State, el Consejo de Estado, or to the Ministry of Culture. And it sounds bizarre, but ironically, I had to do that because in many respects there are fields in Cuba which continue to be ideologically driven, and methodologies as well as interpretations. And so history is one of those fields, and it's a very problematic area of study. You never want to say that you're teaching a class on the history of the revolution because you're not going to get the kind of freedom and ability to take students where you want to take them and have the discussions that you want to have. So I always, in fact, focused on slavery, even though I'm not a specialist of slavery and its legacies. And in the end, in many respects, that was strategically brilliant. And it wasn't even my idea. It came from the Instituto de Historia, which for decades was my partner until very recently. Instituto de Historia is an annex to the Central Committee of the Communist Party. There are many, many people in the Council of State and in the Communist Party who wanted to see this kind of exchange and who still wanted to see this kind of exchange deepened. They also wanted to study how we study. And having top historians accompany us as guides, as pedagogues, but not as graders, allow them to experience a very different form of pedagogy than what is standard in Cuba. So having said that, I'll say that slavery was and has traditionally been studied only as an economic system. So you don't study racism as part of the study of slavery, which makes absolutely no sense. Racism was supposed to have been a kind of false consciousness, and it's not reproduced, official story, either in the policies of the state after 1959, nor in the discourse of its leaders, nor in the pedagogy of schools. So it becomes a taboo subject. And it's a paradox because racism is everywhere in Cuba, and people are very aware of it. And in fact, the best way by which my students would learn from Cubans, how do you study racism here? How do you talk about it? Well, first you don't talk about it. And they tend to explain to students through a joke, an age-old joke. And the joke is as follows. I have to say it in Spanish. Hay dos cosas que ningún cubano en el mundo soporta. Primero el racismo y segundo los negros, right? Which is there are two things that no Cuban in the world will ever stand. One is racism and two is black people, right? So this paradox and the fact that Cubans are willing to engage with students about this has meant that I have had extraordinary experiences. I have taught about 12 courses ranging in time between 8 weeks and 1 week. The shortest is the one that I've taught here with undergraduates. I have brought graduate students to Cuba regularly. So I have done that here at the University of Florida through the Fundación Núñez Jiménez, which is part of the Ministry of Culture, and we created a kind of convenio or agreement of exchange in which they agreed to give our students what the Instituto de Historia had given my students in the past, and that is actually a professional research visa, as opposed to a student visa, which is what the University of Havana gives you. And having a professional research visa, even if you're only 18, even if you're an undergraduate, allows for all kinds of freedom of movement and freedom of discussion and filming and interviewing other Cubans, et cetera, that you wouldn't get if you were just on a regular visa. So that has meant all the difference, and I hope that we continue with them. The Instituto de Historia has, which provided me 36 visas personally to me. I've known them since 1995. They have now expressed an interest in working with us to bring, to do the kind of courses that I used to do with the Instituto de Historia. So I hope we can do this here at the University of Florida. What we have done since I arrived in 2010 was to, for the first time, I think, bring top Latin Americanists to study Cuban history. This is Alexis Baldacci, as she's called in Cuba, but Baldacci in the United States. And she went with me to Cuba in 2011. It was very useful. It is very useful to have your advisor with you, to introduce you. Cuba is a place where personal connections and trust is foremost before anything else. And so having your advisor really makes all the difference. And Lexi was on her first trip there. She spent 9 months there this year. The Fundación arranged for her to have a 2-year residency card. All of this based on, in fact, the good work that she did. It showed that she was working when she was there, always working. In fact, she seemed to be opening the National Library, at times the National Archive. Same is true of Daniel Fernandez, another Ph.D. student in Cuban history. This is on his first trip here. I, again, accompanied him and did all the introductions. He has now spent about a month there this summer and has yet to finalize his exam, so we're waiting for that. Then we've also done a graduate student trip in March of 2015. These are all small, but they were 2 weeks long, and we went all the way out to eastern Cuba and to kind of scout research sites and develop new relations, because I've been to Cuba more than 40-something times, but always western Cuba, middle of the island west, and now it's time for me to move east. So we had an extraordinary experience in Holguin. She went back. The eastern part of the island, for all that it's supposed to be the most revolutionary part, is also the most Caribbean part. And so, in fact, the state is less present, and she got almost immediate access to the provincial archives there when she returned. I want to talk about the first undergraduate course that UF has done there in history. This was the result of many of these students taking up to 6 of my classes, which is all of the undergraduate classes that I teach. I had a kind of a junior seminar dinner at my house. They staged a sit-in where they just refused to leave until I signed on to, to helping them figure out how to get us to Cuba for a week. Some of them were taking a Cuba-Puerto Rico history class at the time. Others had already taken it. It was a requirement that you had taken this class or be taking it. The kids who were in the class got course credit, and those who were outside of the class did it as an independent study. So this was awesome because these kids knew history, a lot of history. And so seeing these places and seeing the multiple histories rolled into one in one site was what made all the difference. So to give an example, we went to El Morro, which is of course the famous kind of fortress. It was built mostly in the 18th century right on the Bay of Havana. But most of it, aside from the colonial history which we've studied, what they were most interested in was going to the top of the tower, because in the 1933 revolution, this dictator named Machado was very famous for having thrown the victims of torture, mostly students, political activists that were disappeared by goons of his regime. He would order them thrown over the tower into the bay below. And at the time, Havana had no basic garbage system. So all the garbage was dumped into the bay, and this was just raw garbage. This is the 1920s, early 30s. So it was just like teeming with sharks, and you get eaten alive. And the students, all of them would remember these stories from my lectures. And to have it all be in one place, all of this in one place, the invasion of the British in the 1760s, the 1933 revolution, I mean, it kind of blows their minds. And so I do believe that there's something to be said about having courses like this that follow on the heels. Don't worry, I will keep to my time. Follow on the heels. There are also new things you learn when you invite, as we did, local historians who had visited the University of Florida at that point as part of our exchanges. And this is the first place where a mass was held in the 1500s in Havana underneath this ceiba tree. So it's a tradition that if you make 3 turns around the tree and you make a wish and you kiss the tree, that you get it. You get that wish. So this group, I'm going to cry, wished that we would all return together to this place, and they did this loop around the tree. So I can't tell you how bonding it is and how unique. This is Christian, who at the Museum of the City found his great-grandfather hanging on the wall. Almost every Cuban kid I've ever had in my classes has had something like this happen. He also met family members whom he had never met and had not seen his family for 45 years. They turned out to be Afro-Cuban, and that was quite a shock for Christian. It was quite a shock for them too, actually, I have to say. Slavery was there behind glass. But it was also there in the stories that people told. We went to the interior, we went to Trinidad, which is the capital of slave wealth in the 18th century through 1853. And so, in fact, when students would talk, because there was so little of it on display, what was mostly on display was the wealth of the planters. So we went to plantations that were unexcavated. There seemed to be no Museum of Slavery, and there is no Museum of Slavery in Trinidad. There's one. It's been inaugurated only just 6 years ago in Matanzas. But so the students would ask people, and this is a town where it's cobblestone, and literally 4 different kids came back with the same story, that they asked people what they remembered of slavery, and regardless of color, the person would say, you know what, honey? Every single one of those cobblestones is the tear of a slave. And it was an awesome experience to have that conversation. to see also the opulence of the planters, to see this double desk. On the other side are these enormous chairs where you're supposed to smoke a cigar and fall asleep after you've eaten your huge meal in the afternoon. So the best way to study Cuba is in Cuba. And also bringing Cuban historians here, I'm wrapping up. Reinaldo Funes, who is the first and only historian of the environment in Cuba, does environmental history. I have known him for 19 years. He volunteered to help on this expedition with this group of students that you've just seen. This is Dr. Quiza, who came as well, and is a specialist of Rotary clubs. He's a specialist of the participation of Cuba in world fairs. We've had Oilda Hevia stay here for 2 weeks, who is really the only black historian, black female historian of black female history in Cuba. And she gave a wonderful presentation. Unfortunately, because of when she came, there were very few undergraduates here, but she became very instrumental to the visits of the graduate students. And so this is Reinaldo Funes giving a talk in the Old Smathers Latin American collection. I want to end by saying that the library part of our exchanges has been deeply fruitful. We have an intense relationship with the director of the National Library, who has come here now, I think 3 times, and we are hoping to bring him again. Dean Judy Russell went with a delegation that I led in November of 2013. And I can tell you that they are delighted to exchange materials with us, in part because their internet service is so slow that, in fact, the materials we give them in DVD that are copies of what we have are easier for Cuban users to use in the National Library in Cuba than their own computer system, which has digitized works on it. So the way in which we have collaborated, I think, is unique. And again, the trust that lies at the heart of that has been the best part of it. So I hope that we can bring Torres Cuevas here again very soon, and that all of this can be repeated and deepened. Thank you very much.
Yeah, there's this one here too.
All right. So thank you all for coming. When Phil talked to me about this workshop, he essentially said, give us some idea of what you did on your study abroad course, and I'm certainly going to do that, and then I'm going to end up talking about some opportunities. But I want to go back to something that Lillian said. I think that's really important, and I think if you want to pursue opportunities in Cuba, it's all about building relationships. It's about building trust. And the way that this study abroad program actually was initiated started in that 2011 visit with the rector at the University of Havana and some faculty members there. That led to an exchange of faculty that went to the University of Havana. And again, some faculty from the University of Havana come to the University of Florida. But during that time, dialogues were initiated, relationships. Do you need this as opposed to? Is this better? Okay, sorry about that. But it was, I think, during that time that we really built the relationships that we needed to initiate a collaboration, right? And it's that collaboration that was grounded in some of the scientific interests that allowed us to pursue this study abroad program. And again, Bill Messino and Fred Royce had a lot to do with that early on, and I'm thankful for them for doing that. One of the faculty members that was involved early on is a faculty member named Jorge Angulo. For those of you who don't know them or him, he was the director of the Marine Science Center at the University of Havana, and I'm very happy to say that he's here as a visiting professor and exchange scholar at the University of Florida this year. He's in the back of the room. Say hello, Jorge.
I'm also very happy to say that Anne-Marie Alvarez, who is a graduate student at the University of Florida, is joining us today. She is, as to my knowledge, in the most recent times, the first Cuban national as a graduate student here. So say hello, Anne-Marie. Okay, so this course, again, it was put together by 3 faculty members. One of them was Don Berenger, probably the lead person in this whole deal. Don is a marine ecologist and a disease ecologist. He has appointments in the School of Forest Resources and Conservation, as well as the Emerging Pathogens Institute. Another faculty member was Luke Flore, who's in the Department of Agronomy, and myself. And so we're ecologists by training, and so the course is, from a substantive kind of perspective, a bit different than what Lillian described for her course, but we're interested in activities on the land use activities, and how they might affect the ecology of the nearshore marine environment. But when we brought the students here, we had a couple of things in mind. We wanted them to learn more than just ecology. We wanted them to gain an appreciation for the history of Cuba, understand the present political relationship, as well as the cultural relationships that exist between Cubans in the United States, citizens in the United States. So we provided an opportunity for them to do that, but we also, of course, wanted them to learn about coastal marine issues and the effect of land use activities on nearshore marine environments and living marine resources. So we started the course. It's a 12-day course. We spent 2 days in Havana. Again, I think everybody in this room realizes what a culturally rich city Havana is, and I think the students really enjoyed that. They were allowed 2 days to kind of immerse themselves in some of the arts, look at, again, some of the other things, the music, just the culture in general. So I think they really enjoyed that. And after 2 days there, what we did is we decided to head into the interior of Cuba. We went to Viñales, and for those of you who don't know that, Viñales is a National Heritage Site, and it's a wonderful place to actually bring students. It gave us an opportunity to explore some traditional agricultural systems. We looked at tobacco farms. We looked at some actually well-managed forest areas. We looked at some agroecology areas. And again, just continue to explore some of the natural resources in Cuba. And there are a lot of them. It's a large island, and it has, again, not only a rich culture, but it's rich with regard to its natural resources. Having said that, they have problems there as well, right? And so if you look in this picture up at the right, you'll see in the back a plant that's called marabou, and it's an invasive species, and it's particularly problematic. And so Cuba has invasive species issues. South Florida, everywhere in the world has invasive species issues, but it allows us to draw some very interesting parallels, and I'll get to that again here in a minute. After we spent some time in Viñales, okay, again, most of us, or Don and I in particular, are interested in coastal environments, and so we headed south to the Isle of Youth. And the Isle of Youth is an island in Cuba, but it's interesting. It's the second largest island in Cuba, but it's also the 7th largest island in the Caribbean. Again, it gives you an idea of the scale of some of the things that we're talking about. And I think a lot of people don't appreciate actually how big Cuba really is. But it's a wonderful place to work because it's relatively impacted from some of the stresses that affect similar systems in the United States, particularly South Florida and Florida Bay. And the mangroves are very healthy. The seagrasses, as you see here, are lush. They're not fouled with epiphytic algae that are typically in some more areas in the United States that might receive a lot of nutrient influence, for example. But we also, after exploring these kind of what I would consider very near-shore coastal areas, we also allow the students to go look at some of the most pristine reefs that are left in the Caribbean. And that's a really special thing for a lot of students, particularly from Florida, who are used to maybe swimming around in the Florida Keys. And if they can find coral cover that's 10%, they're pretty excited. In the south part of Cuba, you can very routinely find coral environments where there's 40% coral cover, 80% coral cover in some spots. And what you see here is it's elkhorn coral. It's an endangered species, and it seems to be thriving in Florida. So there's a lot of really interesting parallels to be drawn and opportunities for marine scientists in Cuba. We talked a lot in that class about conservation issues, marine protected areas, how they function in Cuba, how they function in the United States. And again, as in the terrestrial system, we also talked about invasive species issues, because lionfish are affecting the Caribbean and other places in the South Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, and Cuba is not immune to that problem. So I think by all accounts it was a great class. I really do. I think we got really good feedback from the students. Again, it was a really rich experience. I think we're going to go back in 2016 and we're going to offer the course again, and hopefully we can expand it. I think there are other opportunities. We're in discussions now with the Organization for Tropical Studies of doing a similar course having to do specifically with agroecology. I think, again, there's some really interesting opportunities there for faculty from the University of Florida who are interested in that subject area to get involved, and if they are interested, just give me a shout and we can talk more about it. But moving beyond the study abroad courses, I'd like to talk about some other opportunities that I see based on my own experiences and my discussions with Jorge and others, faculty from the University of Havana. And again, Lillian pointed it out, she never worked at the University of Havana, right? And there's a lot of universities in Cuba, and there's one in every province. So there's a lot of institutes that are analogous to our federal governments, and so there's just tons of opportunities. They have issues, and they're interested, I think, in working in these areas, public health and emerging pathogens. We're perfectly set up to do that. We've got experts here that can contribute to that. Sustainable agriculture, we've been doing it for a long time. Things like renewable energy, education. I think education is a good one. I think there's opportunities moving forward to develop dual degree programs, combined degree programs, and exchange programs that we haven't built yet, but the time is right. They're obviously interested in sustainable tourism. How is Cuba going to be affected in the very near future? They're not ignorant of the fact that the environmental problems moving forward are going to be huge. Climate change, environmental change is a big issue. And so they have other interests in like sustainable infrastructure. So engineering technology is also going to be very important moving forward. So the last thing I want to say is there are opportunities, but I think when you want to explore opportunities there, I think you have to meet the right people, all right? And I think you have to develop a dialogue. I think you have to build those relationships and build trust. And I think one of the things that University of Florida has done is they've built trust with the institutions in Cuba, and we're really in a good position moving forward to develop and implement programs or cooperate or collaborate in a way that's going to allow us to move forward more effectively.
Thanks, Phil. Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bill Messina. I'm with the Food and Resource Economics Department, and I have to say it's really exciting to see so many people here today. I started working in Cuba back in 1994, and I'm not sure I ever envisioned this level of interest at UF. It's very, very exciting. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to step back and look at some general observations on how we launched our program, maybe provide some input and insight to folks who are just getting ready or thinking about launching a program down in Cuba. So it's a little different perspective than what we've had so far. Key components. Now this first point is something that I make as a social scientist, an agricultural economist in particular. I think it pertains to ag economists, folks in the College of Business. Cuba issues are so politically sensitive here in Florida that I think you need to be careful about taking an advocacy role. It's a caution that we've tried to be very careful to follow. In fact, this is an example of a slide that I use in most of my presentations where I say we are analysts, we're not advocates. We don't recommend a lifting of the embargo, we don't recommend a tightening of the embargo. We're just trying to get information into the hands of people, economic information and analysis into the hands of people who are interested, whether that's USDA, Florida's agricultural sector has very, very much interest in Cuba, U.S. agriculture more broadly. You may or may not know that in 2000 there was legislation passed allowing the sale of food and medicine to Cuba. U.S. agriculture has shipped over $5 billion, that's billion with a B, $5 billion worth of food and agricultural products to Cuba over the last 15 years. So it's important to U.S. agriculture more broadly. We've also done presentations to congressional committees, briefings to USDA. So we're just trying to get information into people's hands. That may not be as much of an issue for the physical, biological sciences or some of the other social sciences, but it's a caution that I feel compelled to toss out as my first point. There's a total of 5 points I want to cover here just briefly. At some point, you're going to need funding. You, at this point, might have some residual left over in grant accounts that you could use for the first trip to Cuba, maybe a couple trips to Cuba. You're not going to be able to count on much funding from University of Havana or whatever research institutions that you're working on in Cuba, working with in Cuba. They've got extraordinarily well-trained scientists, very, very talented people working down there, but they really don't have much in the way of resources. So you're going to be needing to think about some funding opportunities. Where do you go? Foundations are certainly one of the places that the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation funded some of our early work. We've worked with other foundations. We've gotten federal money from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So there's lots of opportunities out there. One caution, very important. The U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, has tens of millions of dollars for research on Cuba every year. The problem is it's to promote democratic transition on the island, and that's considered seditious activity. If you take USAID money, I can guarantee you, you won't get time of day from anybody down there in Cuba. Plus, it has the potential to detrimentally impact the reputation that the University of Florida has built as an institution that's interested in genuine, apolitical collaboration and discussion and interaction and research. So don't touch USAID money. Even though it's out there and it's big dollars, it's not something that you're going to be able to take in and utilize down in Cuba. Over time, working for 20 years, we've seen U.S. policies change. We've seen state-level policies change. At this point, there are very few restrictions and constraints on our ability to work and collaborate down there. It is my hope that it stays that way, because we've been through some tough times in terms of U.S. regulations, state-level regulations. But keep that in the back of your mind. There may be obstacles that pop up, and you're going to need to kind of push through. Fourth point, you're going to have to find a correct counterpart institution. We work with the University of Havana because that's where the best economists are, and we were very fortunate to find a team of economists at the University of Havana that focus and work on agricultural issues, and been great working relationships. When you work with folks that long, you kind of watch each other's families grow up, and you really develop quite an extraordinary friendship with the folks down there. So it's been very rewarding for us. You've heard examples of other institutions that Lily and Tom were talking about utilizing for research purposes. So you want to find the right institution. And the last point here, when you go down to Cuba, you want to have a plan or an idea or a proposal for a research project. We went down in 1994, a professor who's since retired, Jose Alvarez, worked out of our Belgrade Research Center, Cuban-American professor. He and I went down in 94, sat down across the table with people we'd never met before, had some interaction with them through email and that sort of thing, and we laid out a proposal for a cooperative, collaborative research project. And we didn't realize it at the time, but the most important thing we said in laying out that proposal was, what do you think? What do you think of this idea? Apparently in Cuba, over the years, there have been a lot of European institutions that have come in or international organizations that have come in and said, we have money and this is what we're going to do. Our collaborators, once we got to know them well, said that was really important because they hadn't really been consulted very much. So over the course of that first week on our visit, they said, well, we like this idea, we like this idea, this one's okay, we really don't like this one, but what about these? And we worked together to develop a genuinely collaborative relationship that's been very, very rewarding. So go down with a plan on issues that you think are going to be of interest to the Cubans, but then solicit their input too, and I think you'll get a very, very positive and strong response. Working in Cuba is a challenge. It's a command and control economy. Sometimes there's lots of levels in decision making. There have been instances where we proposed an idea to our collaborators at the University of Havana, and they said, well, we need to take this to the University of Havana administration. And the University of Havana administration said, that's a good idea, we like that idea, but we have to get permission from the Ministry of Higher Education. And the Ministry of Higher Education said, okay, that seems like a good idea, but we have to get approval from the Ministry of Agriculture. So it doesn't happen all the time, but sometimes there's lots of layers that you got to work your way through, and none of those things tend to happen quickly. Which brings me to the next point on this slide. When you're working in Cuba, you have to be patient. It takes time. You need to be as patient. Your output per unit of input is going to be worse in Cuba in terms of collaborative research than any place you've ever worked. And it's not the fault of the scientists in Cuba. It's more the fault of the system in Cuba, and in some instances, the system here in the United States. Again, the situation with diplomatic relations being resumed, I think, is going to alleviate some of that, hopefully. But because it takes a lot of time, I would issue a caution that it may not be the best use of time and energy for assistant professors. It's exciting, it's interesting, but you're on a timeline and it's the publish or perish, so there are cautions associated with assistant professors getting very deeply involved. And if you aren't seriously committed, don't bother. If you're not willing to put the time and effort forth, it's an interesting place to visit. Everybody likes to visit Cuba. But if you're not really seriously interested in doing genuine collaborative research, take a people-to-people trip and go see Cuba before things change too much. But don't try to launch something if you're not willing to put a lot of effort and energy into it. How do you meet potential collaborators? I'm always surprised at the number of people who have an international component to their research who say, you know, I met so-and-so from Cuba at an international meeting recently, so you may well already have some contacts in Cuba. Having Jorge here is certainly a real pleasure and an honor and a privilege for us on marine and ecological issues. He's going to be a wonderful resource for us to have here and help us identify some other collaborators that we may work with. But use your international professional associations and meetings, or maybe you know someone in Mexico and say, you know, geez, do you know anybody in Cuba that has the interest in the same issues that you and I are interested in? So certainly keep that in mind. There are a lot of U.S. universities that are all of a sudden really interested in Cuba. I was in Cuba last week with a delegation from the Midwest. There was a dean from Purdue University trying to figure out what they can do to get involved in Cuba. I think it's going to be overwhelming for the Cubans, the number of American institutions that are going to be interested in working, collaborating down there. And that would trouble me more, except that UF has a real leg up. I mean, we've been working down there so long. We've got a wonderful reputation. When we write proposals, joint proposals for funding with our Cuban counterparts, they want to call us the University of Gainesville because they want to be real careful that people in Cuba don't think we're the University of Miami. Because the University of Miami has taken a lot of USAID money. And so we said we can't say that. So we usually compromise. University of Florida, Gainesville is how we write joint proposals. But we've got UF has a wonderful reputation, and we want to make sure that we maintain that with good, solid research efforts and activities. This is a list. I think we've talked about most of these things. We do have a cooperative agreement with the University of Havana. I think we're on our third or fourth revision of that, or not revision, but the renewal of that. We've done a lot of collaborative research. Graduate students from Cuba up here, a few, and that's why having Amati up here to get her Ph.D. is such a real treat for us. That's something we had talked about, was it 3 or 4 years ago when you were here, Amati, and we talked about it, and it took a while, but we finally have her here started in this fall for a Ph.D. in the School of Natural Resources and the Environment. That's very, very exciting for us. A lot of our students gone down there. You've heard certainly of all of the work that Lily has done, and she's done a tremendous amount when she arrived on campus to boost the level of Cuba activity here at the University of Florida. We've actually published jointly books, volumes, research papers. We've arranged for our collaborators to present at professional meetings here in the United States, and on 2 occasions, we've actually been able to arrange for them to present briefings at USDA, which is kind of unusual, but it's been very, very well received there. The courses you've heard about, you heard about Jorge coming, so when you look at a lot of these institutions that are started to get interested in Cuba, and they make a list of things they want to do, that's the list, and we're doing them all. So that's a real exciting thing for UF. Just a final slide here. This is a photograph of the U.S. Embassy in Cuba. Sometimes people think, oh, we just have to establish an embassy. That building was built in the early 1950s. It was the location of the U.S. Embassy from 1953 until we cut off diplomatic relations in '61. It remained empty and guarded from '61 till 1977 when President Jimmy Carter reopened it as an interest section. They can't call them an embassy because we didn't have diplomatic relations, so it was called an interest section, and now it's our embassy. And it actually takes up an entire city block in Havana. The yellow line there outlines the U.S. Embassy complex, and then you see a road, and then you see a sidewalk, and then that's the Straits of Florida that you see on the top edge of that picture. 90 miles north of there is Key West, Florida. So it's quite a, when you're there in Cuba, you're so close, and yet for so many years it seemed like it was so far, and now with the opening of diplomatic relations, it seems certainly to be gotten a lot closer. So that wraps up my presentation. Thank you all very much, and I'm looking forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you. I guess, is this working? Okay, good. We'll set that aside. Again, my name is Fred Royce. I'm in the Department of Agricultural and Biological Engineering, and I took my first trip to Cuba in 1995 to do research on the sugarcane production cooperative, and haven't been able to keep me out of there ever since. First, a question. I'm going to make this brief so we get to the questions people here have, because I think that's the most important part of this meeting. But first, I had a question for you. I'm curious for all of us, and all of you too. How many people here have visited Cuba already? And I know some of you have, so I'm checking a little bit. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's about half, maybe, or so. And of the people here who may or may not have visited, everyone here, we assume, is interested in research in Cuba of some sort or with Cubans. Who has some contacts already? They feel like they, either from previous research or meetings, such as Bill mentioned. Okay, a pretty good number. I think that both of those aspects are important. I think that one thing I wanted to point out, Tom, I don't think that of the three of you that really organized the class from this side, I don't think any of you are really fluent Spanish speakers. Is that right?
Not too good.
Yeah, and yet they carried off a very, very successful course, and got all the cooperation they needed. Everything fell into place. I understand there was one glitch where they had to wait for a bus for an hour or so. So, I mean, that was the worst thing that happened. So, the reason I say that is that a lot of Cubans know English, and we have good contacts there, and so that sort of barrier, which it's not an advantage not to be fluent in Spanish probably, but it shouldn't stand in the way of people who want to do to work in Cuba or with Cubans. And I want to mention with Cubans, we really in the early 2000s, when we were defining the nature of what we'd been doing already for, I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 years, we decided to talk about a Cuba program rather than a Cuba Studies Center. The idea of a Cuba Studies Center never entered our mind because we really we didn't feel like our primary mission was to study Cuba. We felt that our primary mission was to study with Cubans. And much of the content of what we've looked at has been in Cuba, but some of it has been in Florida too. And I hope that someday it might be in Haiti or in Africa or somewhere else that we would be working with Cuban scholars on a joint project of study that might not be in Cuba in any way at all. And so that's, I think that's very important for us to keep in mind as we move into new projects with Cuba and with Cuban scholars, that we keep these sort of options on the table. We've indeed in the one of the main current project we have, which is that we have under the agreement with the University of Havana, which is an agricultural focused project. The Cubans have come to Florida. They've done interviews here. We've helped them set up these interviews, and we've helped them do much of the very same activities that we like to do when we're in Cuba. So take that for what it's worth. As Bill mentioned, nearly all of our funding up to now has come from private sources. But for universities such as UF, federal sources are vitally important. And the research effort with Cuba, particularly given the paucity of funds or support of any sort beyond intellectual that can come from Cuba itself, federal funding will be absolutely necessary. So I'm working with people now to begin to get more federal funding into a circuit close to Cuba or towards, in some way involved with Cuba. I don't think that's going to be easy always. I think there are some barriers. But, and program administrators in both countries will probably be kind of doubtful, what, from both sides, what? But it's going to happen, and I think that there's no place that we can promote that better than the University of Florida, because we have very good contacts both in federal agencies and in Cuba. So my recommendation there would be, for those of you who are thinking about this, talk to your program administrators, and when they go, what? Then you just explain, well, there's diplomatic relations now, what are the rules? And they'll have to look them up and get back to you and move forward as best you can, because that'll be absolutely necessary. Again, as Bill mentioned, stay as far as you can stay away from USAID, the Agency for U.S. Agency for International Development. Eventually they'll come around and have an honest development program with Cuba, but that is not what exists right now. So that's just absolutely off the table. And in general with U.S. government funds, you have to be careful. You have to mention the Cubans that we're working with those. Initially, certainly pay your own salaries or your students' assistantships or what have you. Travel to Cuba and leave and find other funding, probably complementary funding as best you can from maybe private sources for funding directly, maybe for equipment purchases for Cuba, or to pay per diems for Cubans when they travel, more direct payments, because that could actually still cause problems in Cuba. There are rules, I don't know if they're written or not, but they're in people's heads at least, about accepting money from any U.S. government sources. So we'll try and let them, they'll be dealing with that over the next few years. But that doesn't mean that U.S. Federal funds cannot greatly support the work we do in Cuba, and indirectly perhaps, and somewhat directly, at least funding our travel there. The final thing I wanted to mention, I've kind of been paying attention, trying to fill in a few of the holes here that perceived, but I'm sure you all will fill in the real holes in what you want to know about. Tom mentioned some areas, and I had a few more to add that I think are really just low-hanging fruit, just things that are just waiting to happen. They're not in my field, of course, so I can't really do very much. Maybe that's why I'm mentioning them, in hopes that somebody will grab onto this. Historic preservation. I mean, there are so many parallels between Florida and Cuba, whether it's St. Augustine in Florida and Baracoa or Old Havana in Cuba, and the historic preservation, whether it's preserving old buildings and forts and that sort of thing, documents, of which there are a whole bunch of in Cuba, and a lot of them actually pertain to Florida, I understand. We could probably learn a lot about our own history from the archives there, and they need preservation. And oral history, which is doesn't go quite that far back. but there's an awful lot of oral history preservation that should be done in Cuba. And I know that UF has a lot of capacity in all of these areas. Wildlife conservation is something that Cubans are very interested in. I know we are too, and Cuba has some very interesting wildlife. Tom mentioned sustainable development. He mentioned the engineering aspects, and I really am beginning to promote an engineering tour to Cuba, because I think that's an area that would be very fertile, and it would be, University of Havana doesn't have much engineering. That's not part of their curriculum, really. So we need to open that a little more between the the University of Florida and Cuba in general. The Director of International Relations at the University of Havana, last time I met with her, mentioned natural sciences in general, chemistry, physics, biology, environmental science, as areas that the Cubans are vitally interested in. And when they're interested and we're interested, then things move a lot more quickly. Migration studies, which to the Cubans generally means migration of Cubans to Florida and other places around the world. People migration from the U.S. to Cuba, particularly in earlier parts of the last century. And food science were what she mentioned. Finally, there's an area that was brought to my attention just a couple of days ago. The treasurer of the Gator Salsa Club sent me an email and told me about how much the Salsa Club would really like to get better connected with Cuba. They understand that some people know salsa there or something and how to dance, and so we'll see how that goes. So there's just an infinity of areas, and I'll leave it there, and I'm sure that Phil will direct the questions as best he can.
Thank you, Phil. And thanks to all our panelists. So I believe we have people who are going to be circulating with a microphone, 2 microphones right here. So if you want to just stand up, 1 microphone, stand up if you want to ask a question. Say your name and where you're from, and then ask your question. You might want to stand up, not just raise your hand.
Claudia.
Might not be on.
Hello? Yeah. Okay, Claudia Romero, Department of Biology and Latin American Studies. Wanted to ask to those of you who have had courses from UF students there, if you have had efforts to bring Cuban students on board of those courses and on those activities, just to have more of like the student-student exchange on the ground. Thanks.
Well, I'll say that the University of Havana has offered since about 1994 classes for foreign students. That catalog of classes is not available to all students at the University of Havana. It's a political selection process as to who gets to take the classes with the foreign students so that they're not ideologically contaminated. And I'm not kidding about that. This past, just a few months ago, the catalog was circulated and it caused quite a scandal at the University of Havana. So no, it's technically not allowed, and when you get students in your classes, were you, for instance, to open the doors and invite, you know, the students are not going to self-select. Everybody would be thrilled to take a class, you know, that you might offer, I might offer. But you're going to get, you know, UJC students, members of the communist youth, and that creates its own problems because they have to, regardless of degree of interest or not in doing so, they have to render reports, you know, they have to informar. And so, you know, I don't want to have that as part of the deal, you know, and yet it will be part of the deal, you know, that's an automatic thing. Harvard, Dartmouth, and Brown have now a consortium together called GASA. I'm very close to the Harvard people. I went to Dartmouth. It's a semester abroad program. You know, it's undoubtedly the case that you're not, you don't have that kind of freedom, you know, to, but, you know, they have on occasion been happy to entertain bringing in students that are selected for them to be in their classes. And, you know, I think that it's up to the professor as to how far you want to do this, and you really need to know, too, how it works. And you need to know your institution, but more importantly, the people that you're working with directly, et cetera. I personally don't want anybody informing on me, you know, and I do have them. I mean, I have minders, you know, the Instituto de Historia itself, you know, everybody who was there when I was doing my trips, et cetera, were militants of the Communist Party. I mean, there wasn't one historian who was not. It was a requirement. So, you know, that always was a present part of our relationships. The knowledge that, you know, they could be called anytime and say, hey, compañero, you know, ¿qué es lo que va a estar haciendo Lillian Guerra a las 3 de la tarde contigo hablando? ¿De qué hablaron? You know, what were you guys talking about at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when you went out for some ice cream? But I've been at this for 20 years, you know. I think it's a different deal when you're bringing in young lives and young students. And there you need to be careful because they can be very emotionally impacted by what they think of as real relationships. They may not be real relationships. So sorry for the fragmentation of a response, but there you have it.
Yep. I think for a little different perspective, we have always considered that would be a very good idea. For example, on the field trips we take to visit cooperatives and see different agricultural systems, our vision is always to have incorporated some particularly Cuban graduate students. But the problem is always the money. You know, we always get down to the wire, and it's the students can't use their scholarships because it came from state funding sources, and until recently those were not usable. And so, for a variety of reasons, money was very tight, and we really could never commit to setting that up. I mean, it's almost as though the very scarcity means that we couldn't start talking about it until we had some assurance that we could do it, and we never had that assurance. And I would advise you to, later you could talk with Jorge Angulo, who's right behind you, and he would have some more insight into that. But I think probably Lillian's area, and being history is much more sensitive, I'm sure that I wouldn't have any problem with minders out on the cooperatives because the cooperative members might be minders. I mean, in Cuba, in Cuban society, there's likely to always be somebody around who's very pro-government to the point of tattling if they think that's the thing to do, or not. And sometimes those people get in big fights with each other right in front of you. But you know, I think that in the natural sciences, particularly, we should strive to do that, and our experience will be much richer if we can be rich enough to manage it.
I wanted to ask about state law. Has that changed? I know the federal government has done things, but are we still pretty much shackled by state law?
No, which state law are you referring to? The Florida law? Well, the Florida law, the 2006 law that was referred to, it did not specifically target Cuba, although the law was written to target Cuba, but the language of the law does not actually state Cuba. It was those countries who were on the list of state sponsors of terrorism, which until May 29th, as Leo mentioned, Cuba was on that list. They're no longer on the list, so that law has no effect in terms of our relationships with Cuba. There was an earlier statute that somebody dug up in 1996 I don't think it was ever enforced, that referred to, I think it was state employees not doing business with countries who, in the Western Hemisphere, with whom we didn't have diplomatic relations. We now have diplomatic relations with Cuba, so that law doesn't apply either. So there are no state restrictions. We are subject to federal restrictions, however, okay, but no particular state restrictions.
There are federal restrictions beyond the embargo.
Yes, there are some, and we're actually hoping at some day. I know Tara DeBose is here from the Research Compliance Office and has actually been investigating some of that, but I don't know that she's at a stage where she wants to address specific issues now. But the International Center, the Center for Latin American Studies, the UF Cuba program, we're going to be meeting with her in the coming weeks because some of these regulations are changing as we speak, And so it'll be important to know how some of those apply, particularly to issues of, you know, laptops, equipment, those kind of issues.
But the primary problem with the 06 legislation was that it prohibited the use of any funds that went through a University of Florida account. That's no longer in place or in force.
Maybe an appropriate moment for just me to mention, right, so there's no state barriers whatsoever. There's still federal law that's changing, as Georgia said. At the university, the provost has asked that for a period of time, you have approval for travel by either the dean or the provost himself for travel, only because we wanted to signal that there's this huge interest, but we want to sort of look at who's going and what. If nothing else to be able to say, it's not just a scramble to go. There have been absolutely no problems and all these things that were referred to but in order to get that, what we need to do is register on the UPIC, International Center's travel registry, and you will get an email that says you've registered for a country for which there are some concerns, contact, I think it says my name, but I send those to Vanessa. Simple procedure. Vanessa will ask you simply to send us an email saying that your dean, or if you are a dean, the provost, has approved your travel, and then you can lift the hold, and you can register for the insurance. There's an additional small form to fill out specific to Cuba in order to get the travel insurance to Cuba. And Vanessa will also issue a letter saying there are still tourism is not allowed in Cuba by federal regulation because of the embargo at the moment, but there's general license means there are 12 categories of reasons for which you can travel to Cuba, one of which is academic purposes expressed in some way. So I think almost everyone in this room will qualify pretty easily for that. It's not strictly required, but we issue a letter saying you're from the University of Florida and you do meet one of those 12 criteria.
Yeah, and just to add to that,
So you sorry, just use the microphone, just put them on. The reason for the microphone is they're recording some of this for anybody else who wants to so we'll issue that. Vanessa can answer more questions about this.
and the dean level's approval also applies not just to faculty, but to students as well who are traveling. Okay? And, however, if you want to bring Cuban scholars here to the University of Florida, that does not require provost or dean level approval.
Well, I mean, I can imagine suddenly getting a request coming from the dean and they say, okay, we're going to go to Cuba. And I wouldn't have had really a basis for making
Well, since the DDD came out in July 22nd, you have a basis. It's all written in a memo from the provost. Yeah. Your dean should have known about it.
I don't know if that's what you're asking, but it is not intended in any way to hinder things. It's simply to keep tabs to ensure we know what's happening. The assumption that there's going to be a lot of activity. You got asked from the outside, who's going to Cuba, how many people, what are they doing, or is there a scramble? And you can say, no, here's the list of who's going, and here's what they went for. And in each case, somebody said this was a good idea for the purpose of the institution. In every case that I know of, someone started with an idea. I don't know if there's anybody who asked and didn't get approval, we didn't talk to them, but so I think there's no problem. It certainly is not intended to hinder anybody. It's simply to keep tabs. So that's normal practice for travel.
I have a question. I'm planning to go to a conference. How about now?
Perfect.
It's on. You have to. Planning to go to a conference next March in Cuba, and my question is, what sort of technology will I be able to take through there, from, let's say, a laptop to the cell phone? I know GPS is probably not a good idea, but I know, Phil, you mentioned that there's still going to be discussions, but
I don't know if I want to put Sarah on the spot right now, but maybe I will.
You can, you can say a personal laptop is okay. What seems to be unclear, unless that's been decided, is whether you can bring a university laptop. And has that been decided?
That's still the case. We haven't decided. There's some new guidance that's out that I actually just started reviewing this week.
Let's get a microphone first.
I guess we did. We put you on the spot after all, didn't we? Sorry.
Okay. Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm Tara DuBois, and I'm the export compliance officer here, and I am rapidly getting up to speed with these issues. I have no near the level of experience as the folks on the panel do. But from my narrow view, which a lot is what you can bring with you and what you can't bring with you, it's changing so quickly. But we are trying to address it and work through it. That's exactly correct. We haven't decided yet whether there will be any changes to the policy of you, as it stands now, you cannot bring university-owned laptop with you. But like I said, I've been reading some guidance and some FAQs lately that might give us some room there. I'm not sure that the university, as senior level, will want to make a change, but I'm going to investigate it further because I think there might be some room with some of these changes. I don't know if that does not answer your question, but basically the deal is, if you're going to travel and you want to bring specific things, the process we're trying to lay out is that somehow, as you register your travel, if you want to bring certain equipment, it will get funneled to me, or you can contact me directly, because a lot of these equipment issues are going to require me to do sort of case by case, and see if I can fit it in certain exemptions and that kind of thing. And like I said, I'm just now getting my head around it. I'm not at the point of making general statements yet, but I'm certainly more than happy to review them as they come in, and I've actually already been doing that.
Barney, getting back to from the Cuba side, we talk about our restrictions. Now, their restrictions, the only thing that I've always taken a laptop, of course, it's never been a university laptop, it's been my personal one. But, and sometimes I've always taken cell phones, and I've never had any problem with any of those things. I've taken components down to people who needed a new motherboard or a hard drive or some other memory SIM or whatever. I've taken all that stuff in my luggage. Lots of different normal computer and electronic equipment. The only thing I ever had a problem with was a little GPS unit for reasons of human smuggling, human trafficking. They don't like those. And in your business, you might want to just see if you can get permission for one of those. They took it away from me at the airport, and they gave it back to me when I left.
Go ahead.
One other quick thing, with regard to students, when we did our study abroad class, we didn't allow them to bring any computers, in large part because there wasn't a real need for them. They're not very well connected with regard to the internet and things like that. So it was actually a real eye-opener for students not to have computers and or cell phones for 12 days. And I think it gave them a brand new perception of what life is like in places other than Florida.
One quick observation on cell phones. As of last week, Verizon has service in Cuba now. And the delegation I was with, I didn't hook into it, but some of the other folks I was traveling with had service.
$3 a megabyte.
It's very expensive. It's very expensive, but it's there.
You can buy, though, you can bring your cell phone and buy sort of these scratch-off cards that allow you to have access to the internet and to text messaging. And they're expensive. They're not that expensive. My students have always done that, and this past summer, when I wasn't there, but my students were there, they were regularly text messaging me through that means. So, I think that that's a great improvement, a vast improvement over where we have been in the past. But the the computers that are available to you in hotels, for instance, for you to use, are extremely slow. So you can buy a scratch-off card and use that internet that's available at a hotel, for instance, or at one of these palacios, the Fundación, or whatever they call them. But it's going to be very slow. Your cell phone's a lot faster. It's a lot faster, and using the same, costing the same amount for this card.
Jorge, you want to bring the microphone back to Jorge?
Oh, okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well,
I'm sorry.
No, since you've got the mic, why don't you go
I'm
first,
sorry.
Susan?
I beg your pardon. I'm sorry.
All right. I'm Susan Paulson from Latin American Studies, and thank you all for your really motivating talks to get us involved, engaged with Cuba in scholarship. I have a question about master's students, younger students who might want to do 2 to 3 months of research. Latin American Studies master's students want to do research. Sustainable development master's students do sort of practical internships for 2 or 3 months. Anyone have guidance, encouragement, discouragement for that kind of actor?
Fred did his master's there in 95, so.
I was there for about 6 weeks, and could have been longer if I had wanted to stay, or if my wife wouldn't have been gone by the time I got back. That hasn't been common. I would be happy to talk to folks, and if there's a concrete idea on the table, we could look at maybe a couple of them, and we could kind of judge which one might be the most easiest to swallow in Havana, and try.
I mean, I've had all three of both the Ph.D. students and 2 master's students do research in Cuba for their masters. They just need a research visa, and that's where, getting this institutional cooperation has been useful to us. However, as an individual, you can, with your advisor's help or advice from somebody like myself, at least in certain fields, you can write to a center and ask them for sponsorship of your project. And then if they approve it, then you get a research visa from that institution. It costs some money, it doesn't cost a lot. And then if you're lucky, the institution will provide you with an advisor on the ground there who may or may not be good. I mean, they have no financial motivation for helping you. They're certainly not getting paid through their center for doing so. But usually Cubans will be very motivated just simply by the possibility of having this relationship and exchange. And then all kinds of material exchanges happen of books and knowledge and resources that makes it worthwhile for that person. So that's how it happens. You just have to have a research visa from an institution in Cuba.
Yeah, I don't think there's any reason that you couldn't have a lot more activity in Cuba. Again, it gets back to something I said earlier. I think it's about identifying your colleagues and your collaborators and establishing the relationships that allow them to provide some support for those students while they're in Cuba.
Yeah, and do not do research on a tourist visa. It's illegal, and you can get, deported. And there are so many folks who have done that, especially in the social sciences, that it's given anthropology a very bad name in Cuba. And you can get a research visa and do, oral history if you wanted to, and interviews if you wanted to. You just need to have an institution sponsor you that will give you that option. But do not go there on a tourist visa and expect that you can get in to do anything. The only thing the tourist visa will allow you to have access to is the National Library as a research site.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be here.
I really enjoyed the discussion, and I would like to say something about it. The main message I want to tell you guys is that there is always a way. There is always a way. Cuba is a changing society so fast, and I'm pretty sure that I've only been here for 3 weeks, and something new is going on down there, right? From 1 week to the other, you see changes. And which is more important, don't pay too much attention to the headlines. Go underneath. There is way more things going on under the headline, right? What is it? Talking things. You say bad things about Americans, some Americans say bad things about Cuba. Forget about that. Just go under and talk to the people and connect. You see how many resources you have. All of a sudden, your vision will lead you to broaden to a new level. Of course, there are issues that are more sensitive than others. Policy issues, very sensitive. History issues can be very sensitive depending on the way you analyze history. Right? Natural sciences is okay. We're bringing U.S. students, British students, anywhere, and talking and exchanging information and ideas and sitting in the same classroom with Cuban students, going out on a field trip with Cuban students. We never had an issue. We have never got a call from some Communist Party guy or some security guy asking me what I was doing. Therefore, if I get that sort of call, I just send it to them. Right? My message here is that there is opportunity. You have to find a way, find the proper person, build relationships. Human relations worth more than money in Cuba.
money, you may get nothing done. But if you go there with the frame, and that person there all the door, and you may even be surprised how high you can get, because it's a matter of human relations, right? And being smart. And don't expect just to see how your regulations change here. That doesn't, it's not like an open door, because we also have regulations. So go ask first. What is it that we want to do? Up to what level we can go? What sort of equipment can we bring in? I tell you, GPS, forget about that. But this is absurd. In the customs law, they said no GPS is allowed. But they recognize that iPhones or smartphones have GPS. So those are good. No, it doesn't make any sense because it's the law. So you may not declare GPS, but you may declare smart. That's the message. Be clever. Right? Find the way around. There is always the way around and pay. And find the proper line. And you get good results.
Question. Is USAID a lost cause? They are supported by tax dollars. Can their agenda not be manipulated by this university and its illustrious people?
No.
I've seen a lot of money wasted by USAID.
Well, we're flying airplanes over the Straits of Florida, broadcasting to Cuba signals that are jammed by Cubans, and we continue to do it. I don't think that there is much prospect. I mean, the congressional monies are allocated to USAID every year to promote democratic transition in Cuba. Yeah, I'm not a political scientist, but I don't think that there's much possibility to change that agenda. But maybe, and
somebody could speak in some committee when they consider these things.
There's lots of lobbying that goes on, but I think that the issue is until U.S. policy changes towards Cuba, just because we're pursuing normalization doesn't mean U.S. policy has fundamentally changed. And we're not supposed to be talking about U.S. foreign policy, but essentially USAID and its agenda is tied to U.S. foreign policy in Cuba. And despite the policy of normalization, the ultimate goals of U.S. policy towards Cuba have not fundamentally changed. So until U.S. policy changes, then it's unlikely that USAID's agenda will change significantly.
Hello. I have a lighter question. I'm expecting a visitor from Cuba, and I kind of wanted to give her a tour of the campus and maybe get her some, University of Florida swag. Are there any resources set up to do that, like from the university, besides just me showing her around my department or my institute or contacting the Cicerones or?
Where are you from?
Department of Environmental and Global Health.
And so you have a visitor from a scientist?
Yeah, it's a visiting scholar. She's coming for a conference in Miami, and she wanted to drive up here and visit the university, and we were interested in kind of starting a dialogue. So we figured showing her around would be a good first step.
What institution is she from in Cuba?
I think it's the National Institute of Epidemiology, Public Health and Hygiene and Microbiology.
Well, I don't know in terms of swag, what. I don't have a lot of it in my office, but you can. Yeah, but I think certainly is she going to be here a few days on campus?
Like a week, I think.
Well, you should certainly contact myself, and we could help to orchestrate some meetings for her. Leo's office as well, other people here on this panel, and we're constantly facilitating those kinds of visits.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah.
And
yeah, sure. And I'll give you my card.
So I understand that the restrictions are lifted for academic travel, but I'd be curious to know whether any of you have had any trouble, any issues coming back going through U.S. immigration. I'm thinking in terms of, for students, for even for you.
I've been down 3 times this year. First time I went down, they looked at the letter I got from the International Center. The second time I went down in April, I handed my passport and the University of Florida letter to immigration, and the guy said, "What's that?" And I said, "It's my letter indicating that I was down there for official research purposes." And he slid it back to me. He said, I don't need to see that. Anybody can go to Cuba now," which I don't think is the official policy, but that's what he said. And this last time, I didn't show them the letter. I just handed my passport. They said, "Where are you from?" I said, "Or where are you coming from?" I said, "Cuba." "What were you doing there?" "I'm with the University of Florida, did research." Stamped the passport. No problems at all.
Sure.
You just need to know the right answers to the questions. Academic research, university faculty, welcome back to the USA. I've been 25 times, never the least bit of trouble.
That's a federally authorized category of travel to Cuba.
But it's important, right? Again, when you go to Cuba, when you register your travel through the International Center, they'll provide you with the paperwork that's necessary should they ask for it. But similarly, I've had no problems coming back.
Two very quick practical questions. With things opening up, is it a little easier to use a credit card? Yeah, okay.
If you're going to travel for a significant period of time, you're going to have to take cash.
Yeah.
If you're going to travel for any period of time, the credit cards do not work yet. Yeah. As of last week, they still didn't work, but they're getting there.
They're getting there. Yeah.
Taking a class with students to countries where you don't need a visa has been pretty straightforward. But going to Cuba, how far in advance? Is there any problem there with students all getting their visas? How much time is that?
You can work through if you work through a travel provider, they can do it automatically for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's authorized travel service providers. Holbrook Travel here in town is one that organizes for groups. They don't do individual faculty trips or groups of 2 or 3, but they'll do larger groups. We can get you the names of some others that we use. If you work through these travel service providers, because you can't call American Airlines and book a flight now. You've got to still have to work through these charter flights organized by travel service providers.
But probably you should have a Cuban partner in that, maybe the university or some other, and they would be involved in the visa process likely too, since that might not be a tourist visa, or it might. They would tell you.
Mm-hmm. I think that one thing to add though is bringing Cuban scholars this way, the visa issue is still problematic.
Yeah.
So we had a group of 5 who were supposed to come on Saturday, and 1 of the 5 got a visa before they were supposed to travel. In the other case, the week before, we had 2 Cuban scholars coming, law faculty. They both got their visas on the Tuesday before the Saturday they were going to travel. That's pretty good. And so what that means is when you're booking their travel, you've got to work through a charter company that's essentially willing to hold that spot for them until the visa is actually approved.
Yeah.
So a couple things too. So I think your interest is time, right? And so for example, when we took our class there, we had a registration date by the end of March, essentially, for a class that was going in May. So the lead time there was about 2 months. So it's pretty reasonable there.
Okay,
Thanks.
Any other questions?
In terms of visas,
Need to get a microphone.
In terms of the visas, would a student who's not necessarily a U.S. citizen be at a disadvantage? Would U.S. citizenship facilitate travel to Cuba? If in the case you would be a Latin American passport holder, like Mercosur?
Most Latin American citizens or from Latin American countries don't need a visa to travel to Cuba. I don't know if there's any Latin American country who needs a visa.
Going back to the United States, that shouldn't be an issue either.
I'm not going to comment on that. I don't know.
The question was whether a third country national,
Right.
non-American who's studying in Florida can travel to Cuba and come back in.
But no, their question was going to a third country, going to another country, going to Cuba.
Yeah, whether the same Americans
They were
that
going.
You have to ask
got one more question. there, sorry. One more question.
No, I have been thinking, so if in all the natural sciences, you might want to bring specimens or to work with specimens or collect specimens, and that's one of the projects that we want to work with. How easy do you think it would be to get permits to collect invasive species?
Yeah,
or wildlife or whatever.
You have to go through the same permitting processes here that you would anytime, right? But Cuba, as Jorge pointed out, they have their own permitting processes, and so you have to work with your collaborators to make sure that you're securing the appropriate permits to bring a specimen back, and that can take some time because there are challenges with the bureaucracy there, just like there are challenges with the bureaucracy here. So it's something that has to be fairly well thought out, and I'd be very patient if you're trying to move specimens back and forth, particularly depending on their protection status, whatever they might be.
We have someone sitting in back who can talk to you later about that, probably very specifically.
Any other questions? Well, I want to thank all of you for coming and all of our panelists as well.